remembering that the Forest Service of the United States does this, and the provinces do this. They set a target volume. Well, this is average. So if we go up to this point, this would be the target volume. We call it allowable annual cut, or annual allowable cut, AAC. Okay, that's what we do in the province. The province owns, 97% of the forest land in Saskatchewan. And it's similar across the country. In the east, there's far more private land, a lot of woodlots. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are loaded with woodlots, a lot of private ownership. The east coast of the United States is mostly private. Weyerhaeuser, all the big companies, Louisiana Pacific, Georgia Pacific. In the west, most of the trees, most of the forests are owned publicly. And there's a reason for that. When lands were settled, harvesting just went at a rapid pace. You look at these old pictures, there's not a twig left in sight. It was like a bulldozer went through there. Cut, rape, pillage, whatever, they took everything. And did they replant? No, because why would you replant when you could just go west and harvest more trees? So this led to this timber, what they call the timber famine. The same happened in Nova Scotia. All the big tall white pines were taken. They used those for shipping masts. Wiped out. You do not see any tall white pine anymore. You get some spindly trees that were replanted, that's it. So in order to ensure that we did not run out of trees, the public lands or public agencies took over the forest lands, and they became, in Canada, part of the Crown. And what we do is set a biological limit in terms of how much you can harvest. So if you're harvesting more than the forest can grow, you're actually going to have a decreasing volume. So if we make sure that the harvest, the annual allowable cut that is available to the forest operators in Saskatchewan is not more than the growth rate, then we shouldn't run out of trees. But you as business people, can you make the decision to harvest based on this? If you were to manage this forest, what information would you need?
Prices.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's a really high price, then you probably want to harvest as much as you could.
Yeah. You need prices. What if the price is, like right now, the price is very low. It's not worth harvesting anything. So never mind cutting the annual allowable cut. It doesn't make any sense biologically. So once we consider prices, we might want to harvest sooner or later. What other things do we need to know? The cost, yeah. You want to know the cost of harvesting, right? If the cost is really high and fuel prices are high and transportation is high and you can't get this particular product to a mill in a cost-effective way, you're not going to make any money. So do you see that information in this picture? No. So we've got public agencies that make decisions about how much to harvest, but they're not economic because we don't consider price and costs. We also don't consider the value of the other things that the forest is producing. If we considered those things, then we would likely harvest at a lower rate than the maximum mean annual increment. Now, it depends where it's going to be. Prices and costs will determine where that's going to be. Okay? So we have to include the price and the cost to be able to make an economic decision. In this case, you don't know if there's a demand as reflected by the price and the willingness to pay, and we don't know what the cost. The cost might be prohibitive in harvesting particular sections of the forest. So once we include that, which is based on the production function, so we still can't run out of trees even if we've got economic information there, then we can make a decision on where to harvest. Okay? Like, you wouldn't operate your private business like that. So why should public agencies operate like that? One of the reasons is because of the fear that private companies will manage and use the forest resources for their own gain. Any questions or comments?
Just out of curiosity, how do you measure the volumes of the growing forests?
How do you measure the volume?
Trees?
Yep. They go out and they do surveys, and they will take sample plots of land, and now it's a lot easier with GIS, so you have maps of whatever. But they used to go out and they would measure DBH, diameter at breast height, which is 4 feet off the ground, and they would have these little doodads where they could figure out how tall the tree was, and you can calculate volume by that. And there's a whole science about forest growth and growth and yield. There's whole journals dedicated to growth and yield, measuring the yield, using the different yields for different products and such. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so let's add the 2 pieces of information to this picture. I'm just curious, do you have another class?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just wondered how the scheduling worked out that you show up at this time each time. Not that I would care, I don't care. Okay. So, where were we? Yes. So we start with our production again. Time and volume. What can I do to volume? I can actually multiply it by the price. And we're just, for now, we assume that it's the same price for each whatever, cubic meter of wood that you sell. It's not entirely true, because the wood will have different values depending on size, and of course, little spindly trees down here aren't worth anything, so. If we take volume, and we multiply it times dollars, times price, what do we get? Total revenue. Now, total revenue is always the same. Total revenue is P times Q. In this case, if we graph it over an input rather than output, we sometimes call it total revenue product, just because it reflects the actual product or the growth. Okay? We call it total revenue or total revenue product. So if we do that, and we have some positive amount, then this becomes total revenue measured in dollars. So now, if I want to see what happens from year to year, for example, this point, this is a change in dollars, and this would be the change in time. So now I'm looking at not just what the forest is adding in terms of growth. You have more volume, right? The forest is growing. But what does that mean in terms of money? What are you adding to revenue from year to year by letting the forest grow? That's what we're thinking about. And that's why it's important to think at the margin. You can look at each point and say, well, is that enough revenue? Is that enough revenue? At what point do you make that decision to harvest? So what we can do over time is map, somewhere in here is probably the maximum, and this would be where 0 occurs. So now we've got MRP, or marginal revenue product. But really, if you can't remember these names, it doesn't matter. What you need to remember is the concept. What are we doing from year to year? We are measuring the change in the dollars we're putting in our pocket. How much more can we put in our pocket if we let the forest grow one more year? Okay? So that's what we're measuring. A change from year to year of the total revenue. That's all it is. So this maps it out. We've got dollars on this axis now. So we've got production. You need 3 pieces of information to make an economic decision. You need the physical production. You need to know what you're making. You need to know the price of the product you're selling, because if it's not worth it, you're not going to sell it or harvest it. And you need to know the cost. And what we typically do is we look at the cost, in this picture anyway, of the input. So what is the cost of time? If this were labor and we were looking at how trees grow and how hiring more people added value to the forest, then we would look at the labor cost, the wage. Okay? If this were fertilizer, we would look at the price of fertilizer per pound or kilo or ton or whatever. So what is the cost of time?
Discount rate.
Yeah, interest rate, right? How much you have to pay. So we can put the interest rate in here. It can be straight, it can be curvy, whatever. So let's put interest. And so the way I have it drawn is that we would harvest at this point, T star. So now we've got the interest rate is the marginal cost, and where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, in this case marginal revenue product, is where we harvest. So we're making a rational decision. Remember those 7 things that I listed at the beginning? You have incentives, you have trade-offs, this and that, and the next thing. This is thinking at the margin, okay? This is, you don't decide to harvest the trees based on the total revenue, or just on whether the growth equals the harvest. Imagine if you ran the farm like that, you wouldn't get anywhere. You pay attention to prices, you pay attention to costs, and you've got the underlying production function. So if you treat the land badly, you mess up this picture, and you mess up the economics. Okay? And you have an incentive to ensure that this happens year after year, or in forestry, rotation after rotation. Because if you were to harvest the trees here, and you didn't look after the land, then the land is not going to be able to produce your next crop of trees and make as much money as you did in the past. So you have an incentive, when you own the land, to manage this such that you care for the physical production, you care for the capital. Okay? Does that make sense?
Or just change your business.
What's that? Or
Or
change your
just
business?
change
What, at this point? So you harvest and then what do?
tourism.
You what? Tourism.
Yeah.
That's a possibility, and that happens a lot. We can actually put that in this picture. That's a good point. How do we can look at what happens to changing prices and changing costs, and we can look at how different inputs affect our output and make decisions about, if this were labor, we would be deciding the optimal number of people to hire. If this were fertilizer, we'd be deciding the optimal fertilizer to put on a crop or whatever. At some point, let's say you've got little spindly trees in here, right? You've just got seedlings. You guys driven up to PA and seen around that area where crop was harvested and they just replant again? And it's just a sea of little green. Well, if you want to walk in the forest, that's probably not what you're looking for. It is a forest, it just happens to look like a meadow. So the value of that is going to be different because of the nature of the resource. And that's true all the way along. So the debate in BC particularly and the western United States is about old growth, right? Preserving old growth. How do we, what they're saying is that there's a trade-off. You can have logging or you can have old growth, but you cannot have both because once you cut down the trees, they're gone. So we're dealing with old trees that are somewhere in this area here, but that are hugely valuable because, I mean, you can do a hole in the middle and drive a car through there. They're absolutely massive. So how do we compensate or show what those values are? Can we do that using this model? If the environment becomes more valuable than the products that we're selling, that we're using.
Well, if you were using like tourism, so if you had that opportunity, you'd be able to like figure out the potential revenue from
Yeah.
tourism and then put that on there and see if that was gonna be more than logging or less than logging.
Yeah, at that point, you're looking at the forest not as just the capital that you're using to produce, but once it starts producing a different good, you're really looking at a substitute. So you're producing something else that becomes more valuable, and at that point, if you wanted to buy the land from the logger or lease it or whatever from the forest owner, and it made economic sense to do that, you would pay them at least what they were making for the forest crop. You know about the Nature Conservancy? They're an interesting organization because they're all about environmental values, and what they do is they pay people. They say that our organization values logs as the forest. So as wildlife, as habitat, as clean streams, as watersheds, whatever. And they are willing to pay whatever price this is, this revenue, and then they convert the forest to some other use. Okay? But the debate is always about logging is bad, we should stop logging, we should stop old growth harvesting, and just use it for, I don't know, woodpeckers and stuff. So there's a value to that, an environmental value. If we know what that value is, and we know society's willing to pay, then it shouldn't be a problem. A lot of times, people are not willing to pay though.